Namaste. Amen and blessed be. Throughout this sermon, and I suppose throughout this month of focusing on evil, it's very easy to point fingers, to say, isn't it a shame that those people do that? I know this because I felt this way as I wrote this sermon. It's very easy to get sucked into that. But I believe that the line between good and evil doesn't run between different types of people. The line between good and evil is a line that runs through each of our hearts. Rather than thinking of evil as something that is out there in the world, today we're going to focus on the ways that it can find a foothold in our own hearts from time to time. Each and every one of us has harbored undue resentment. We've made space for and even fed evil in our own hearts. So I invite you to be aware of the tendency to think of those people and know that this sermon is intended for each and every one of us. This is an opportunity for everyone to recognize the potential for evil and, maybe more importantly, to think about some of the vital skills for responding to it. Now, the inspiration for this morning's sermon came from a Disney movie. It wasn't a hugely successful movie, and to be honest, it wasn't a great one. But it raised some wonderful questions about the nature of evil and morality. The movie that I'm talking about is Maleficent. I don't know if any of you had a chance to see it. See, it was not a big blockbuster hit. Maleficent is the name of the villain in the classic story of Sleeping Beauty. But in this 2014 update of the fairy tale, we hear the backstory that led up to the familiar fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty. In this movie, we learn the story of how Maleficent became who she was and why she cast such a horrible curse on Princess Aurora of Sleeping Beauty. Now, the story is set in this border between two very different worlds. One might be familiar to us. It's the land of humans, where a powerful king ruled and told his people what to do, and they more or less obeyed. Now, the other land was an enchanted land of fairies and a wide assortment of other whimsical beings, and they didn't need a ruler because they all got along beautifully. For a very, very long time, these two worlds coexisted until one day a young peasant boy wandered into the whimsical land and met a young fairy named Maleficent. Over the coming years, a romance grew between Maleficent and this young boy. And on Maleficent's 16th birthday, the boy gave her a wonderful gift, a true love's kiss. As Maleficent grew older and stronger, she became more powerful, and she was the strongest of the fairies, and she became their protector. But meanwhile, this power-hungry king was on a mission to expand his empire. But he couldn't prevail as long as Maleficent was in the way. So finally, on this king's deathbed, he promised to offer his throne to anyone who could slay Maleficent. Hearing this, the poor peasant boy remembered his relationship with Maleficent and realized this was his chance to make something of his life. So he returned to that magical land, and after wooing her a bit, he secretly drugged Maleficent into a deep sleep, and while she was sleeping, sawed off her glorious, powerful fairy wings. When she awoke from her sleep, she was furious and heartbroken. She had loved this man, and for the following years, the tension between the two lands grew deeper and deeper until one day the royal family had a daughter. Because of her hurt and her pain, Because of her disbelief in the true love she had been promised, Maleficent cursed the child, Sleeping Beauty. And after that curse, the king, her former beloved, and Maleficent had tremendous quarrels. The whole story ends where, in the midst of a great battle, as a Disney movie requires, Maleficent allows the king to live, but he just can't let that be, and he makes one final dive at attacking Maleficent and plummets to his death. So scene after scene of this movie explores how evil becomes introduced into our lives. Starting with two very likable characters, two people who loved each other and had great potential, a poison entered both of their lives and nearly destroyed everything that they care about. Now, there's a great deal to be learned from the elaborate fairy tale about how we might notice evil and reduce it in our own hearts. Now, as I said, the story begins by depicting two different worlds, a human world and a magical world. It's not enough that there was simply a border between the lands. In this fairy tale, there were fundamentally different realities. A familiar world and an utterly foreign one, as foreign as we can imagine. It's a perfect place to begin a movie about evil. One of the most insidious and pervasive ways that evil enters into our lives is when we begin to divide and see people as other. The greater the distance we put between ourselves and others, the easier it is to dehumanize them. Well, the obvious example of this is the way Nazis used propaganda to describe Jews as rats and other subhuman categories. Similar language was used to lead up to Rwandan genocide. We might think deeply about the words we use to describe our political adversaries from time to time. But this dehumanization happens in much more subtle ways when we're not careful. The language that we do does an amazing job of separating people and reinforcing differences. And one of the most obvious ways we do that is when we use metaphors of darkness or the color black to describe evil in the world. And yes, those are long established metaphors that we inherit, but we choose our language today. We choose how we will represent the shades of our reality. A less obvious example of language, so that's Maleficent and Sleeping Beauty. A less obvious use of language that I actually just got exposed to during my class when I was away in January is every time we use the words us or we. I'm guilty of doing this in preaching all the time. Every time we use those words, us and we, there is an implied they and them. It's another way, it's a very subtle way of separating out us and them. Dehumanization is so easy to do. And the most obvious mark of it is assuming that someone else is acting out of a destructive or vengeance behavior. But if we really want to understand people, we must start with the assumption that their intentions are as noble as ours. If we really want to understand people, we have to start with the assumption that their intentions are as noble as our own. That's really hard to do, even in a community with people we know and care about. But as soon as we assume that someone is enacting evil in the world, that they are abhorrent, then we set ourselves above them, and we make a cozy space for evil to settle into our own hearts. Another theme that was explored in this movie that I loved is the collateral damage that occurs in a personal destructive agenda. Now, after waking up, Maleficent, when she realized her wings had been sawed off, she became this bitter, mean, drab person. And this whimsical fairyland that she had sort of animated was transformed into this sinister, mysterious, swamp-like place, and everyone was terrified of her. Now, I know she's not the only one with contagious emotions. How often do we let the challenges of our lives seep into other relationships? I did this just the other day, actually. After spending a good hour in a phone, I'll call it a battle, with insurance companies, I was furious, as we've all been there, I think. And so I was a pain in the butt to my friend all evening. I had to call the next day and apologize for being so nasty about it had nothing to do with him. And that was a relatively minor one-day experience. It's possible for any one of us to let a bad seed of discontent bleed over and tarnish other areas of our lives, especially our families. And sometimes that collateral damage happens as we recruit others to be on our side. Now, you may remember in the original Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent had a crow that was her sort of sidekick. Well, that crow continues on, or comes back to Maleficent in this more recent movie. And he starts out as a good guy, like he's not very bad, but she puts him in all these horrible predicaments because she makes him act out her little vengeful scenario. Now, there's nothing more useful in self-righteous indignation than having people that agree with you about how bad those other people are. So we recruit. We point out how mean the other person is. Sometimes this happens as one parent recruits a child and they're in argument with the other parent, maybe. Or sometimes it happens in church. When an interpersonal conflict arises, rather than two people working it out, they start building teams. It's fascinating. What started as an individual resentment spreads among 10 different people. Recruiting teammates for your resentment or revenge is one pretty powerful way that evil can lurk and spread. The last foothold that I want to talk about is the one that's probably developed the most clearly in this movie. It's the tendency that we have to hang on to our resentments. In the movie, we get to see Maleficent and the king evolve over years and years and years of their life. And it's basically the story of how Maleficent became, well, Maleficent. And the king pretty much goes mad with his desire to destroy her and protect his power. But why is letting go so hard to do when someone has wronged us? Now, I think you'll agree with me, this was definitely part of that story. It's even harder when that someone was someone who professed their love to us. Letting go is tough business. And I'm not talking about just separating or putting a legal distance between you. In fact, sometimes that just makes our hearts cling even tighter to the resentment. Letting go of resentment and anger is hard, but it is without a doubt the most important way of managing evil in our lives. Now, the Buddha famously said, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone. You're the only one that gets burned. Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the only one that gets burned. I want to find that embossed on a box of Valentine candies this year. Letting go is hard to do. Paying attention to the recesses in our own hearts where evil lurks is hard to do. It seems that if we want to avoid the collateral damage of revenge, if we want to avoid recruiting teammates on our personal vendettas, then we need something to broaden our perspective a little bit. Each and every one of us needs something to expand our focus beyond that moment of hurt so that we can feel a possibility of hope. We need faith to respond to the evil in the world and the evil that lurks in our own hearts. Faith in something larger than ourselves and the present moment, to add perspective to our life. And our faith needs to be big. It needs to be bigger than ourselves, bigger than anyone we know or any group of people we know. It has to be about something bigger than human institutions. I don't know if I've told this story at Tapestry or not. Last month I talked a little bit about the steps toward ordination, and there are lots of steps in that process. Some of them are easy, some of them are quite difficult. The last major step before becoming an ordained minister is this rigorous interview. Each candidate is interviewed for about an hour by a panel of 7 different people. There are clergy and lay leaders and historians and activists and theologians and mental health professionals on those panels. It's a crazy, daunting experience. But I went into my interview feeling prepared. I had just completed a year of internship with a glowing review from the congregation I served and my supervising minister. I had just graduated from seminary with recognition of Student of the Year, which is a sort of valedictorian honor. And I had all this support from colleagues who said, you'll do great, don't worry about it. So I traveled to San Francisco for my interview, and I didn't pass. It wasn't the end of the world. I just had to come back a year later to try again, but I was heartbroken. It's probably the deepest and most sincere anger that I have felt in my life thus far. I'm sure others will come, but that was the moment. It was bad enough that I didn't pass, but this was the institution that I had invested my life in. By that point, I had spent 4.5 years of full-time schooling and study to become a minister. To me, Unitarian Universalism was the name of the game, and it had rejected me. I learned a lot in the months that followed that day. The interviewing panel had pointed out some honestly valid shortcomings, and I read up on those. But the far more important learning was the way that time impacted my faith. From that encounter, I learned that my faith had to be in something more stable, more deeply held than the institution of Unitarian Universalism. After some profound anger and a litany of profanity on a near daily basis, I came to an important realization. For the first time, I knew that my faith was not in Unitarian Universalism, but my faith was in God. God is what I called it at that time. I don't know if I would call it that today. It's not that sermon. But I do have faith in a goodness that is always present, always available to me and to all of creation. In those hard months after not passing, I learned that having faith in Unitarian Universalism was too small. It was, after all, the very thing that had broken my heart. Now, having faith in any institution or any person just isn't enough. Because those people that we love are not perfect. No one is. If our faith is going to help us respond to evil in our lives, it has to be more. It has to be bigger than a person or a human institution, and it certainly has to be something larger than Tapestry. Now, Methodists don't have faith in the United Methodist Church, they have faith in God. Jews don't have faith in their synagogue, they have faith in God. Well, some of them. There are a lot of atheist Jews. Muslims don't have faith in their mosque, but they have faith in Allah. And even humanists, they don't have faith in their little humanist organization. They have faith in a much deeper and broader human spirit that rests in the heart of every person. So how do we respond to evil as a religious community? Not by celebrating ourselves. We respond to evil by reminding one another of the bigger picture, the bigger faith that sustains them through the challenges that they face. We point one another to a faith that is more invested in relationship than it is in righteousness. Our role is to look beyond this tradition. Our role is to remind one another to keep your hopes set on something bigger, something just around the corner, something greater than you have ever experienced. To invite one another into an expansive faith, so that the anger of the moment, the resentment, the pain, don't have a chance to make a permanent place in our hearts. May it be so. Amen.